Okay. Now we can. Great. Now we're live streaming. All right. So now that we have our commissioners here, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Trap Check Work Group. Welcome, our viewing public. This is our Trap Check Work Group meeting for today. We're planning to go a little bit longer than usual. I understand, though, that there are a number of people who can't stay until 4:30. When I go through the agenda, you'll see that the time from 4 to 4:30 is really focused more on the next steps in the next meeting. And so for those of you who need to leave at 4, we can follow up with you after that. So with that, let's go ahead and go to our next meeting. Our next slide. Oh, you can tell the kind of day I've been having. Zoom meeting tips, same ones as always. If you're an alternate, you're welcome to stay on screen, but we ask that you not participate unless your primary is not here. And then, of course, you are the primary. So, but for alternates, welcome. And for others, for our primaries, you can keep yourself on mute, use your video if you can. As always, we're trying to have this be as much of a real meeting as possible, as if we were in person. So having video on helps with that. Again, if you need any help, you can check with Sam. Her phone number is right here. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. We're all real familiar with all of this. So actually, here's one thing I wanted to share. On our Beaver work group meeting last week, there was an issue that came up about the chat. Actually, Stan brought it to my attention, and it was a good thing you brought it to my attention. So everybody who is viewing this in our public cannot see the chat. And so we really would appreciate it if people wouldn't use the chat unless it's to get something to Samurai, or if there's a question that you want to get in the queue and we can read it, but really try hard not to put a lot of substantive things in the chat, because otherwise I'll have to pause and read it for everybody in our audience because they can't see it. So we'll do if everyone can do their best to use the chat as little as possible, I think that would be really great. And then of course, raise your hand to get in the queue to speak, as you have done. And if you can't find raise your hand, then just raise it and we'll watch for that. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you, Sam. So for our agenda, so if you recall our last meeting, we did what I'm calling Animal Welfare Part 1, where we took a little bit deeper focus looking at best management practices for trapping, as well as trap technology. Jim walked us through some of the modifications that trappers are making to their traps to manage or to have less animal suffering is really the point of that. And so he walked us through some of the modifications to traps and also around the best management practices. And what we agreed was for Animal Welfare 2, for the second part of that conversation, we were going to focus in a little bit more around animal suffering, around animal trauma, and ethical considerations. So that's the other side of the conversation. And so we've got 2 guest speakers today. We have Dave Pauly, who we introduced you all to through email when we sent out the agenda. He's with the Humane Society of the United States. He has connections to many states, as well as to Oregon. And so he will be talking with us about animal welfare and trapping practices, kind of trending in how to manage animal suffering. So that will be what Dave was talking with us about. And then we have Michael Nelson with Oregon State University, who's going to be talking with us a little bit around ethical considerations, as we think about what kinds of management practices we want to recommend, things we want to do differently, things we want to retain. Michael can help us think through kind of the ethical implications of that. He's a researcher at Oregon State University. And one of the things that we did, remember at the last meeting, Tyler asked everybody to answer this question, how do we define humane? And we put that out in the survey, and folks responded to that. And we sent that information to Michael without names attached, just so he could get a sense of sort of the range of where the group is at. And then we've met with Michael and Dave a couple of times to give them an idea of the dynamics of the group and to help them prepare. And then from 4 to 4:30, we'll confirm next steps. We've got an agenda shaping up for our meeting on October, is it 26th, Sam? That's our next meeting? Yeah. So we've got an agenda shaping up for that. So we want to chat with you about that and get your questions, your input on it. And then we'll be done at 4:30 at the latest. So that's our agenda for today. Anybody have any questions? Not seeing any. All right, let's move on to ground rules. So as we've learned with our group, that we've got a broad range of opinions. We're asking people to, I'll start at the act in good faith one at the end. So we're asking people to, act in good faith. We're all here to try to create a space and a conversation to look at, some different alternatives for ODFW, some management objectives that they can consider. And so this is a creative space for us to work collaboratively to try to figure out how to do that. And everyone's coming in good faith to make that happen. We ask that folks participate in an open and mutually respectful way. As we've learned, you hear things that you don't agree with. People have differences of opinions. And we would ask that you listen respectfully. You can certainly disagree. There's no reason for personal attacks. We're all professionals and grown-ups here. We got a couple of other items here around. We ask people to be, fully participate, come prepared for meetings, serve as a liaison. The balanced speaking time, I do want to highlight that it does. I understand that as the conversation's going, it's really, you want to get in on it, or you want to have a conversation with a couple people, and we've allowed that to happen as time has allowed. But it does mean that it's hard for everybody to get in on the discussion. So do be mindful of how often you're asking questions. I will look for participation from folks who we haven't heard from as well. So I think that's everything on the meeting guidelines. No surprises there, just some reminders. So Sam, is our next slide introducing? Okay, so what time do we have? So let's see here. I'm wondering, I think it would be helpful. We've got just a few minutes. We're just like a few minutes ahead of schedule. Can we do a quick round of introductions of everybody so that Michael and Dave know who everybody is? So I've been talking a lot. You guys know who I am. People out in the public, I'm Jamie. I'm the facilitator of this group with Kearns and West, and Sam is with me. Sam, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Sam Mason. I'm also with Kearns and West, and I support the facilitation of this project.
Yeah, and I'm just going to call on everybody, and if you can just say your name, your organization, and if you're a primary or an alternate, and that just gives Michael and Dave a feel for who you all are. So Kevin, you want to go ahead?
Got me quicker than I could do the unmute. I'm Kevin Christensen with Wildlife Services.
And for everybody, Kevin is now a member of this working group. It's a number of people have asked that he be a regular participant. He's come to nearly every meeting. The commissioners had decided that he would be a helpful resource. And so you'll be seeing Kevin at all of our meetings moving forward. Thanks, Kevin. Stan, you want to go and introduce yourself? That's you, Stan.
Stan Steele, the Oregon Trappers Association.
And Stan, are you a primary or an alternate?
Alternate.
Thank you. Let's go to Lauren.
Hi, Lauren Smith, and I'm with the Oregon Farm Bureau now, and I am taking Marianne's place as the primary.
Okay, everybody remembers Lauren used to be with Association of Oregon Counties, and then we have Jordan, who I'm not sure if Jordan's here, who'll be stepping in for Lauren from Association of Oregon Counties. Tyler, you want to go next?
Yeah, hey everybody, I'm Tyler Dungan, the Conservation Coordinator for the Oregon Hunters Association, and I'll be the primary.
Great, thanks, Tyler. Derek?
Afternoon, I'm Derek Roman. I'm the Carnivore Fur Bearer Coordinator for ODFW.
Welcome, Derek. Jill?
Yes, I'm Jill Zarnowitz and Fish and Wildlife Commission, and I'm primary.
Welcome, Jill. Kelly?
Hi, I'm Kelly Peterson with the Humane Society of the United States, and I'm a primary.
Welcome, Kelly. Quinn?
Good afternoon. My name is Quinn Reed. I'm the Oregon Policy Director for the Center for Biological Diversity. And Jamie and Sam, I'm going to try to finagle my schedule a little bit so I can be here until 4:30, but that may mean I go on mute around 3:30 to spare you the noise of me picking up my preschooler.
Okay. Thanks for the heads up.
Yep.
Jim?
Jim Swords with the Oregon Trappers Association. I'm the primary.
Okay. Shannon?
Good afternoon. I'm Shannon Hearn, Deputy Director here at Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm the primary, and my secondary is Kevin Blakely. He's the Deputy Administrator at Wildlife Division. He is out on vacation. At 3:30, I too have to pick up a teenager, so I'll save you guys and mute myself from that loud pickup.
Okay. Thanks, Shannon. Amy?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Amy Patrick. I'm with the Oregon Hunters Association, and I am the alternate today.
Thanks, Amy. Greg?
Hi, I'm Greg Woolley. I'm Vice Chair of the ODFW Commission. I think I dropped off a little bit earlier, so I relocated. I think maybe my Wi-Fi is better now.
Yeah, you have a little hand up.
I do.
Yeah. Is that just because you wanted to introduce yourself, or was there something else?
So I'm not showing a raise hand function.
Huh. Yeah, I see it. There's just a little hand up on your screen.
Wow, that's funny. It doesn't show up on my screen.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I'll just watch for that.
Okay.
And then we've got Bob, who's helping us with tech. And then we have, who else do we have? Kyle.
Good afternoon, everybody. Kyle Williams with the Oregon Forest Industries Council, and I'm Lauren's backup.
Welcome, Kyle. And then we have Michelle with ODFW, who is our staff support as well. And is JB, oh, Jeff. Who is Jeff?
Good afternoon, everyone. USDA Wildlife Services, I am Kevin's alternate.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for reminding me. Yep. Welcome. Okay, so Michael and Dave, that's who we are. And then we have a cast of, I don't know, hundreds watching us, a goodly number of people who tune into these meetings. And then these meetings are recorded and posted up on the ODFW website. So thanks everybody for taking a moment to introduce yourselves to our guest speakers. So our first guest speaker is Dave. So Dave Pauly, if you'd like to introduce yourself, let us know a little bit about you, and we'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? I'm doing new headphones here.
Yeah, you sound good.
All right, great. Well, yeah, great panels, great membership. I think this discussion and the journey from this discussion is always important. I'll give you just a little background on myself. I'm currently a Montana master naturalist, but in the past and I'm also a wildlife conflict resolution specialist for the Humane Society of the United States and Humane Society International on some projects. I happen to be on vacation this week, but I'm down in Kauai, Hawaii, helping a group catch 2,000 to 3,000 feral cats for a project. So I don't have to leave to pick any of them up. I finished that this morning, but I'm just very happy to be here. So past history, I've been involved with trapping. For 56 years. I started when I was 10 years old. Early in 1979 to 81, I served as the president of the Wisconsin Trappers Association. And at that same time, and a few years after that, I was the owner operator of a wildlife damage control or a conflict resolution business called Humane Animal Controls in Madison, Wisconsin. And that included predator trapping, mostly coyote, fox, and beaver work, but also lots and lots of raccoons, because Madison is a 4-lake state. So raccoons and squirrels were probably my big items, but I also did predator control. Since then, I've gone through a number of career changes, from animal control to a local humane society to the last 30 years with the HSUS. And in 1999, I served on the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Commission's Trappers Advisory Committee, which was very similar to many of the input processes that Oregon participates in. And that was about I want to say 8-week process. And we went around the state and held public meetings and took input. And it was really to get input from all sectors on trapping and its impacts, and on many of the same issues that you guys are looking at, from trap check to almost anything that impacts people. Then I had a 20-year hiatus from that committee, and I served again on the 2019 Trappers Advisory Committee. I was the only person either informed or foolish enough to do it a second time. But it was a really good comparative process, because I got to see what changed in public attitudes of trapping. And I should frame that Montana has recreational trapping and advanced recreational trapping. They don't really have a commercial trapper's license or a breakdown. So trapping is trapping, but they do have a very strong division between fur bearer trapping and predator trapping, one being controlled by the department, the other being controlled by the Department of Agriculture. So, but there were some key differences in that 20-year shift, in that in 1999, there was not even any discussion of things like trap-free zones, like creating places, trap-free dog parks, trap-free wildlife areas. That wasn't even on the table. It just wasn't either socially or culturally acceptable in 1999. In 2019, that was a big point of discussion, is that there should be safe places for people to recreate, and safe pheasant hunting areas, and safe public lands where people who hike or hunt with their dogs simply did not have to worry about encountering a body grip trap, a foothold trap, or a snare. So as it won't surprise you guys, the issue of trap check was in both those meetings. It's a continual controversy in all states, because it impacts the way a person practices either their hobby, their recreation, or their business, as it may be. So I guess to summarize that, I've been a lifelong hunter, trapper, fisher, but I've always worked towards, as a reformist, not an abolitionist, to change to trapping and other public resources. In 1984, when I was president of the Wisconsin Trappers Association, I accepted an award from the Wisconsin DNR, Department of Natural Resources, for the Conservation Association of the Year. And that was because in 1983, in the legislative session, the Wisconsin Trappers Association worked with the Montana Audubon Society to promulgate or put forward a regulation on exposed bait. Wisconsin was having a real issue with bald eagles being caught in muskrat and mink sets, or mink sets set with muskrat carcasses. And so the association agreed to put forth a 50-foot rule on any bait visual from above 1 pound or greater as a buffer zone for traps. And the Montana Audubon Society, actually the Madison chapter of the Wisconsin Audubon Society, nominated the Wisconsin Trappers Association for the Conservation Association of the Year. We can look back, 84 is a long time ago, but still it was, I think the newspaper said, strange bedfellows have created a good law, because the birders and the trappers work together to protect eagles. So that's kind of the framework from where I'm coming from. And then more specific to this topic, especially trap check laws or trapping in general, 80 countries and 8 states have restricted trapping in some substantial way. And at the same time, some Western states, specifically Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, have loosened regulations on trapping with the advent of the wolf trap and the larger jaw spread and on power snares. I don't know if power snares are on the agenda, but mechanically assisted snares are now legal in Wyoming because they were considered to be more humane, but we can discuss later, but I would argue they're more lethal, but they're not necessarily more humane. I know that was a discussion point you guys had on the definition, but more lethal, but less humane if they're on a deer's snout or my dog's torso or, any other application. So one of my key points in this discussion is to say that my experience is that self-regulation could be key to extending the public relations perspective of trapping in general, whether we're talking recreational trapping or more commercial. So I think that one point of discussion or one thing I want to put forward is that the public, there's a vast majority of the public that don't know what trapping is. And I think all groups should put forward a joint effort to have a message of what trapping is. I think we can, I want to tell one quick story, if I may. I was director of a humane society in Eastern Washington, and I got a call from an apple orchardist who said, "Sir, is there any chance you have 6 fully pregnant cats that I could adopt?" And my answer was, well, I've never been asked that question. So what do you want to do with 6 fully pregnant cats? And he said, well, I'm an apple orchardist and I'm raising a new apple, the Honeycrisp apple. And I have irrigation lines buried in the ground and the coyotes were digging up my irrigation line. So I hired a trapper and he killed over 2 years, the coyotes on the property, the foxes on the property, the raccoons on the property. And now he's having an outburst of meadow voles or meadow mice, and they are actually doing more damage to his trees than the short interruption from the coyote's water. So I said, I'd go out there and just take a look. And it seemed a pretty basic solution. My suggestion was stop killing coyotes and just put a water bowl on the end of each one of your irrigation lines. And the coyotes will come get the water and they'll provide free rodent control. And you can all do this without spending a lot of money. So the message there was the humane economy was that by investing less on services, his cost of good was reduced and he had higher profit by not trapping. I'm not suggesting that's a model across the board, but it is just that not every solution is solved by lethal control. In fact, I would argue there's very few good examples of where lethal control in itself has solved the problem. I mean, we have more coyotes in the United States today than we've ever had. Eradication of almost any species has really not worked. Trapping can be an important component on a micro level, on a property level, but I think game commissions and decision makers have to recognize that there is a difference between trapping on private land and trapping on public land. And that often is not differentiated in regs, but the differentiation is made on trapping fur bearers versus trapping predators. And in many, many Western states, predators get no protection. I would advocate that you should regulate the practice or the device and not what it's used for. So just consistent regulation so that law enforcement can easily enforce regulations. Then we get to public perception of trapping and specifically the 24-hour or daily trap check. And that in itself is controversial. I've worked on 13 different states with trapping regulations, and they all have varied from when the clock starts to tick on a trap check. For instance, in some states, a citizen can see see an animal in a trap in distress, and they call Fish and Game or they call the sheriff's office, and then they call and dispatch a warden. And those states could have a 24-hour check or a 48-hour check, but that check time generally does not start until the game warden gets to the site, tags the site, puts up a trap camera, whatever the mechanism is for solving. And so by that time, the animal could already be in there 48, 72 hours. So the trap check laws themselves have to be constrained or designed so that they are true to their goal of minimizing the amount of time that the animal's in the traps. So I wasn't involved in your discussion or your poll on the definition of humane, but I was just in Eugene probably 8 days ago doing a program for the Oregon Animal Control Council. And part of that was defining what is humane from the animal control officer's perspective. And there's really two definitions of humane. One is made by either statute or administrative rule, which says what that is. And the second is more common sense. And that's what I tell animal control officers, is that if it looks bad or feels bad, it probably is. So, you know, you can say in any device, one common comment from the trapping community is that they come upon their animals and they're lying down sleeping. So therefore they are not in pain or that it's not inhumane. And that's really not a good litmus test. I mean, so I just want to toss that out there, that humaneness is very difficult to define, but that it has to be looked at in a whole perspective. In many cases, if a veterinarian examined that animal, they would definitely show that that animal was in pain, either from loss of circulation or from biting on the trap with their teeth and having teeth or jaw damage. So I applaud you guys looking at this because it is complex. And I would hope that we really look to the broad definition of the public, not just hikers with hounds and not just, I mean, hikers with dogs and hunters with hounds, but to the general population who wants to have a reasonable expectation that when they hike on public lands, they're not going to be exposed to some device that they cannot figure out how to open, not know anything about it, and put their animals or their pets, their dogs at risk. I did have one more kind of summary statement, and that is that trapping is, from the recreational basis, you know, I guess what I'm trying to say is that trapping and trapping associations often say that we are over-regulated. And I just want to point out that I'm a hunter, a fisher, a trapper, and of all those activities, trapping is absolutely the least regulated. And I'm saying that in Montana, as a fisherman, I can only put 2 fishing lines in the water. I can't leave them unattended for any time. As a hunter, I can carry a long rifle and a sidearm, but never leave them unattended to take. And I also can't sell commercially anything that I harvest from those activities. So even mushrooming and berry picking in Montana is more heavily regulated than trapping. So I just want to throw that out there, that it's a unique activity, which is one of very few where the participant can convert public property to private property the second the jaws close. And that's a right. I mean, it's defined, but coming along with that should come the responsibility that that trapper should be responsible for injuries to a dog that's legally at the place. I mean, it's a rights responsibility thing. And I just think that regulation in any format can be a positive thing to protect people and their pets. And that's kind of a summary. I probably better I just answer questions when my time comes. But thank you very much for looking at this issue and for offering the opportunity.
Thanks, Dave. We did want to have the group spend some time with you to answer questions before we hear from Michael. So what kind of questions do you have? It looks like Greg's already in the queue. Go ahead and use the raise hand function if you can find it, or just put your hand up so I can put you in the queue so you can ask questions of Dave. Okay, Jim, you'll be after Greg. All right, Greg, go.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Dave, for coming and talking with us. Really appreciate having you. One of the things you said is that self-regulation is important. And I just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, on what you mean by self-regulation. And then another question, you talked about standardization of regulations. It implied, you talked about how predator trapping is less regulated, and I was wondering what kind of recommendations you might have around that. And finally, thanks for recognizing the ecological value of coyotes. They were very underappreciated, in my opinion. So thank you for putting a plug in for coyotes.
All right.
That's all I have for now.
Thank you, Greg. What was the very first one? I got the second one. The first one was?
First one was about self-regulation.
Oh, yes, thank you. Well, I guess my comment was that self-regulation is often an unused opportunity. I think that's why I gave that Wisconsin Trappers Association thing about us promoting an exposed bait rule. And I don't know if that's a dated concept or not, but it should be an opportunity for groups to say, if we're going to be regulated, we want to be actively involved in the decision, and we want to get credit for saying that we recognize that traps create conflict. Trapped and trapped animals create conflict. And the easiest way to self-regulate, from my opinion, is to do everything you can to avoid capturing dogs, because that is the issue that is going to restrict trapping in many municipal areas, many counties, and many states. So things like, I'll use the example of the large body grip traps, sometimes called counterbears, the 330 size traps. Many states require those traps to be fully submerged because they are technically a beaver otter trap. But when they're not fully submerged, they have the opportunity to kill dogs that are swimming in the water and going to get out. So Wyoming has a law that says that 10-inch trap must be covered with 1 inch of water. And that doesn't really accomplish anything. Montana has a partially submerged, but doesn't really define that. So I think trappers associations should embrace the opportunity to say, we don't want to kill dogs. We just simply want to prove we don't want to kill dogs. So we are going to bring forward from us that we would like to see all large body grip traps totally submerged, and just be done with it. Just take dogs off the table, because that is a self-regulation opportunity I think agencies should be embracing. And then the second one was what?
Muted myself again. The second one was about, so one of the things that we talked about, and I know you've talked about in other states, is the fact that predator trapping does not have the same level of regulation.
Yes, thank you.
As fur bearers. And, that's something we've gone back and forth about. And so I just want to know what, from your experience would be, what sort of alignment there should be.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. Yeah. And I apologize. I told you I was in Hawaii. I didn't tell you that we are trapping from 10 p.m. to 10 a.m. And I just got off a 12-hour ship. So my brain is a little scrambled. So apologize. But definitely, I'll give you an example. And I could use several Western states, but I'll use Montana since I've been so actively involved. I can have a number 2 coil spring or any size trap, and I can have it in my hand. And when I set it in the ground, I can say, this is a predator trap. I just set a predator trap. And therefore, I have almost no regulations because it's a predator trap now under the Department of Agriculture. And I still have to tag it, still have to have my name on it. That's about it. If I say, oh, this is a fur bearer trap, and I set it, then I have the regulations of the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And that just, and a game warden, imagine a game warden's issues when he tries to enforce an ordinance or statute or administrative rule. And he has to go through the painstaking effort of first proving what type of trap it was. So that's my point of saying the device, this device that I'm putting in the ground should be regulated, and it should be regulated whether I set it to catch a non-game animal, a fur-bearing animal, or a predator. We should be regulating devices and activity, and not political spectrums of who's in charge. And I realize that's not easy to do, but the same is true. You brought forth my comment, my coyote comment, and the same is true. I don't think a coyote should have any less, a coyote or any predator should have any less protections in a trap than a fur bearer species, that they should be uniform, that they're all treated as humanely as possible, that they all have the same trap check regulations, and that again, we are regulating the speed, we are regulating the activity and not what species class we have put them in. So that it just makes a game warden's job of putting responsibility and consequences easy to do. They can say, okay, this is a trap, it wasn't tagged, it was illegally set, or it was legally set, and therefore these rules apply. So, okay. Does that answer that, Craig?
Pretty much. I'll yield my time. I know that there are other folks that have questions, so I may circle back later.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Greg. So next up is Jim, and then Jill and Quinn. Jim, go ahead.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. Yeah, Dave, you mentioned you got a large number of cats there in Hawaii. What happened to those cats after you caught them?
These cats are part of the greater good big fix. So some of the cats are being spayed and put into a sanctuary. I'd say that the majority of the cats are being released on the private property from where they came. They're not all feral cats. I think yesterday it was about 50-50. 50% of the cats were brought in by the public, 50% were caught at the request of the public landowners. So it is it's not a TNR program. The cats are captured, they're vaccinated, they are spayed. Some will be going to the sanctuary. Some will be going, Jim, to, I don't know the name, they have it here, but basically farm cats. They'll go to people who want cats for rodent control, but none are being captured on or released from public lands. It's totally a private property issue. So they're private cats or cats impacting private citizens, and they're all agree to having them spayed, vaccinated, and released or sent to sanctuary.
Well, cats are famous for damaging a lot of wildlife.
Yeah, I agree, Jim. And I struggled with TNR type programs for decades, but the reality, or the scientific reality, is that because here the big issue is shorebirds and endangered species, and I totally respect and understand that, but the reality also is that a lactating or pregnant female cat is going to kill a lot more wildlife than one who is sterile, and not only that, the sterile cat is going to fill the void so more cats don't come in. I did a project, Jim, in Montana in the late 80s. We had a skunk rabies outbreak, and they sent me to Helena to learn how to put out strychnine eggs, and I knew I wasn't going to do that. So I came back and we live trapped and euthanized about 400 skunks the first year, and about 280 of those were female. And we did a post-mortem on those females, thinking that we could justify our expense of doing skunk trapping. And the average litter size of those skunks was 4.3 kits per litter. for those skunks the first year. The second year, and we were just trapping Jim around schools and the river access and high concentration areas where skunks might have exposures to kids and cats. So we did the exact same area the next year. And to our surprise, we caught 100 more skunks. But even more surprising, the average litter size of those skunks jumped to 6.3 kits per litter. So in 1 year, litter size went from 4.8 to 6.3, and that was because we hammered the skunks. We hit them pretty hard and euthanized them. It was all trap euthanized. It was counterproductive. We had more skunks and we had bigger litters. So we took that money rather than trap the third year and hired 3 vets, and we went out and vaccinated dogs and cats in all those areas. So our goal was to get 80% of the dogs and cats protected, and it worked slick. Year 4, we went out and trapped and gave birth control to skunks. The first time was Norplant human. The second time was PZP, porcine zona pellucida. And that combination of vaccinating dogs and cats and slowly reducing the population of skunks, man, that was the ticket. I mean, worked much better for us in Yellowstone County, Montana, than knowing that we'd have to go out and kill 600 skunks every year, 700 or whatever. So that's bringing that back to your question about feral cats. It's the same thing in that those cats hold a population point. They don't reproduce. Their need to catch wildlife is reduced. And yeah, it's not perfect, my friend. You know that some cats are very effective predators. There was another study in your question in Australia in 2017. There was an island that had albatross hatchlings, and they went in and eradicated the cats in that island. I forget the number, but a couple hundred cats. They went in and eradicated the cats, expected to have a much better hatch rate and more fledglings, and they found that both were reduced because the roof rats, the black rats, they ate both the eggs and the chicks, where the cats pretty much just ate the chicks. And so again, eradication of those cats was not the solution. The solution was to maybe monitor, reduce the cat population, but still let them fulfill that rodent protection role. So it's not pure science on either side, but people have to experiment with those options and find out that sometimes lethal control is the ticket, and sometimes it's counterproductive.
Thanks for that, Dave. Jim, did you have any other questions for Dave right now?
Not right now.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Jill, you were up next.
Okay, I have a question. In any of the areas that you've worked, is trapping controlled by watershed at all? In other words, where there's water, say in this watershed, there's no more trapping versus, just a broad, yes, you could trap in all of Oregon.
Yeah. Good question, Jill. Not enacted legislation or rulemaking. Wisconsin is looking at that right now for beavers, at regulating beaver trapping by watershed. I don't think there's been a rule promulgated, but they're talking about that being a very effective solution because it's a natural control of migration and populations and whatever. We don't do any of it in Montana. Wyoming doesn't. I think it would have great potential to be a logical control restraint, but I don't. If you'd like, I can do a little dip into research after I get done with this and see if there's anything. But I haven't. That's very interesting. I haven't looked at it that way. So sorry.
Yeah, I'd be interested in that. The other thing is you're very concerned about trapping dogs and affecting people in that way. We're also concerned about trapping any other wildlife, as an agency.
Yes.
So has that come up in any of your experience with other commissions or departments?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I might have misrepresented myself. I used the dog example as the opportunity for trappers to do some public relations work, because that is a key. Certainly the general public is as concerned or maybe more concerned if they see a raptor in a trap or if they see a non-target animal in the trap. So yeah, that's always a thing. and I do know that the manufacturers, have worked on pan tension and worked on some other devices to eliminate or minimize non-targets. I do want to just say one thing about all those things. I forget if it was Jamie or somebody mentioned that a lot of things have been done to improve traps for animal welfare. And that's kind of sort of true, but really all those things were done to increase fur retention, is to stop escapes. And I mean, that's a side journey. We don't really need to go there, except for traps like the muskrat stop loss trap was a trap that when the muskrat was caught, a spring came up and came over its shoulder and pinned its head so it could not get to its foot. That was not done for the comfort of the muskrat. That was done to prevent a chew out or a ring out or whatever. Those devices that have been proposed for purely animal welfare purposes, like having an anesthetic nub on a trap, so when an animal chewed on it, it might, those have not gone very far because they're expensive, potentially. They're different, they're change. Change is always tough. So I do think some things, bottom trap swivels have been a great change. There have been some things, but the devices, especially footholds, are still pretty much the device of 100 years ago with a few nice refinements for swiveling tension. But to answer your question directly about non-targets, yes, I probably get more calls on a non-target animal, a songbird, a game bird, definitely raptors being caught in traps, waterfowl being caught in traps. And they are very distressing to people, especially in devices that they have no idea how to get them out of. And now in the Western states with the larger jaw sizes and the bigger traps, I just did a trapping program in Wyoming in Jackson, maybe 5 weeks ago, and handled my first very large fork quad coil foothold trap. And there's very few people that encounter this trap that's going to be able to open it and get it off an animal. And the same thing with body grips. They're a Rubik's Cube, an animal gets in there. Very few people are going to figure out how to get it out. Although trapping associations and departments have done a good job of trying to train non-targets. Dogs are a non-target, but dogs and non-target wildlife are push buttons for public relations nightmares.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Dave. Quinn, you're up.
Yeah, I think I probably have two questions, but the first one, Dave, and thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between time spent in traps and impacts to the animal, whether that's injury or stress or what have you. I would just love to hear a little bit more about that dynamic and that correlation, if any.
Yeah, thank you, Quinn. With the full disclosure that I am not a doctor of veterinary medicine, there are some obvious things with the relationship of length of time in trap and trap injury. Depends upon the type of trap, the amount of circulation, and a foothold trap, the amount of circulation that can get through to the foot. But I think an obvious, almost indisputable argument is that the longer animals in a foothold trap, the more you are going to see dental damage, jaw damage, because that animal is going to work on the thing that's restraining it, and it's usually steel and dental and teeth do not go well together, and those damages often aren't seen. On traps that do not allow circulation, you have a pretty big swelling of the fingers or paw underneath the jaw. The animal's not going to work that because there's not feeling. But with these larger, big jaw spreads, ones that are very deep, there's more of a concern that some species will be able to get their jaw under the trap. And because there is no feeling, they could do substantial damage to that limb. But it's kind of, and I will tell you, my specialty in life is live traps. And I used to call them humane cage traps. Now I just call them cage traps because, like all these devices, the longer an animal is in them, the more damage they're going to get from paw rub, face rub. So when I set cage traps, I'm setting about 400 of them this week. I always have a worry toy in the trap, a Kong, an apple, depending upon the species with cats, cat toys, something that they can work on or worry rather than just work on the trap. Because I have seen cats in a live trap get serious injuries, face rub, bite rub. And then the third thing is when an animal is in a trap of any design, any type, it easily gets dehydrated, can easily get hyperthermia or hypothermia, depending upon the temperature, and easily go into shock from stress. So the longer, there's definitely a correlation, and a veterinarian could probably build a better case, but there is definitely a correlation between the time and the amount of time in a trap and the extent of injuries.
Thank you. The quick follow-up to that is, so one of the things that, I think this group, we understand is, if you have a longer interval for trap check times, it doesn't necessarily mean that an animal is in the trap for that amount of time. So I'm curious, in your experience, what's the rationale for states that go with shorter times? Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. The states that have gone with shorter times is because they had to establish a standard. They had to establish a standard that they thought was socially acceptable, not just to trappers, but to non-trappers, to hikers and hunters. And short times, I mean, everybody understands 24 hours. People do think Wyoming has for snares and body grip traps, they have to be checked once a week, which means it could be 14 days. And the logic is that an animal in those traps is probably dead and shouldn't need to be checked so frequently. But the reality is body grip traps and misappropriated snares are not always lethal. And therefore, many animals could be in there sideways and in there for 2 weeks before being checked. So they try to so states that are more progressive try to move back to err on the side of reducing extended injury. Scientifically, shorter times are better. From a lay veterinary knowledge, from talking to people, shorter times are better. But politically, shorter times are a time bomb. People raise sometimes good arguments about not being able to get to that number of sets. People raise, all the issues against a shorter time period. I do think that the AFWA statement that was introduced is pretty solid. It just says that all trappers should maximize the effort to minimize the amount of time that animals are in traps. And I think that's the common sense central point where all decision-making groups have to go to and say, yeah, 24, 48, there's no magic number. Most states tend to fall on the shorter end of that because it minimizes the potential for damage and injury, but it does impact the men and women who are out there setting steel, and change is hard. Change is tough, and restrictions are tough. So there's always pushback. But the 30-some states that have done it have not had huge fallout from a shorter trap check time. I mean, the practice still goes on. People adjust. It seems to work in those states without causing a lot of citations or a lot of feedback.
Tyler, you had your hand up, but it went back down.
It caught me. Thanks for giving me the airtime. So that wasn't really a question, but it could be, Dave, if you wanted to speak to this. But, hopefully we all just read the BMPs and White et al. 2020. And I think it said, be careful about assuming that there is a positive correlation between time spent in trap and increase in injury. And I think the reasoning for that was the timing that injuries are likely to occur at the beginning of the trap, or the interval, I guess you might say, when an animal is trapped, and then at the end when the trapper is approaching the trap. So can you speak to that? And then Derek, can you speak to that?
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. You mentioned a couple of variables. There's probably 24 variables. Is that trap near a roadway where every time a car goes by, the animal gets spooked? Is the trap approached to avian predators that he might, increase his stress? What's the temperature? Is he on moist ground or dry ground? I mean, yeah, I think you need to be careful. As the BMP said, you need to be careful, but you also don't need to assume that there's no difference between 24 hours and 72 hours. I don't think there's enough empirical data to categorically say that, but I think there's enough anecdotal information from around the country that says, yeah, and again, from the trapper perspective, I didn't want to leave a fox or a coyote or a raccoon in a trap for an extended period of time because it's exposed to other predators. I could have fur loss, and I know that's something that some of the trappers will say, well, yeah, we want to get there as fast as possible. We just don't want to tell you, we just don't want to have you tell us how fast that needs to be. And that's a political reality. But I think that, again, and this may be a public lands, private lands issue too, where on private lands, it's not as big of an issue because there's not a lot of public people hiking and dogs out there. But on public lands, where it's a multi-use thing, and people are going to expose to those animals, and that's going to increase stress. And I have no doubt from my personal experience that I want to get things out of the traps as quick as possible. Sometimes, daily checks, at least 24-hour checks, to minimize the opportunity for negative experiences.
Yeah, Todd, I don't know if you wanted what you wanted me to explicitly try to touch on, but definitely agree with Dave in that there are a lot of factors at play. And that's definitely one of the things that the BMPs are trying to experiment more with, just the putting cameras up in all these stations. Anybody that's done research, especially that has cameras deployed on traps of all different types, inevitably, speaking from my personal experience, when the trap is deployed, regardless of the trap type, the animal kind of freaks out. But again, in my experience, the majority of the time, once the animal has now kind of realized that it's restrained, at least physically, it stops all the thrashing. It stops most of those actions, which again, most of the BMPs are designed to try to reduce, like shock springs and things like that. So that way you don't have dislocations and things. But certainly, stress of the animal in a trap for some period of time that can be quantified. We do it all the time for a number of species, looking at stress levels, looking at hormone levels. But yeah, I don't know if I'm familiar with something out there that's tried to look at that or try to quantify, X amount of hours in a particular type of trap, which granted, each trap is very different. Even box traps sometimes are the worst. So yeah, it's very, very, very variable.
Yeah, and I'll just mention here again, an opportunity for further research. I mean, as you mentioned, I'm well familiar with the looking at stress hormones and things that might indicate quote unquote suffering, right? I mean, I'm just trying to get us back to something that we can quantify, something tangible, rather than, how sad an animal looks like in a trap.
So I've got a follow-up, and Derek, maybe you're the one to answer this, or Dave. So one of the things Sam and I were talking about as we were preparing for this meeting is this question of technology. And Derek, you mentioned it about cameras. I mean, Dave, how is technology being used to address some of the issues that we hear, from Jim and others about, that it's very challenging in some geographies to get, to check your traps every 24 hours. There are seasonal, and weather conditions that prevent that from happening. What are some ways that technology are being used to address some of these issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know if you can see this. These are my camera traps that I'm using here to monitor cat traps. Motion activated, little tiny, relatively inexpensive camera traps, not the quality of some of my other camera traps, but these devices are telling us tons of information on how an animal reacts to a trap, how an animal approaches a trap. It's just that part of the technology is really good. I think some of my friends on here are, I've been on the USDA Wild Pig Task Force for 10 years, and this is a little off topic, but pig feeders are now being set up with facial recognition so that they will only dispense bait to pigs and not to raccoons or bears that might be negatively affected by the bait. So the opportunity for technology, we also are working on a facial recognition for deer, white-tailed deer, that we contracept to get them to monitor them and make sure we have the right deer coming in. So it doesn't specifically deal with commercial or recreational trapping, but those technologies are helpful. They're going to teach us a lot about animal behavior and biology. I'm trying to think, this isn't really technology, but pan tension adjustment is a huge thing that can help alleviate a lot of problems. And I don't know, maybe my trapper associates can elaborate more on that, but it's underutilized by the average trapper. I think longliners and people who run a lot of traps pay more attention to how to use a simple technology like pan tension to eliminate non-target captures.
Can you say that again? What are you saying? Pan tension?
Yeah, pan tension. Okay, so well, in a foothold trap, you have jaws and springs, and then the jaws are spread. And so if you have your pan tension adjusted properly, cottontail rabbits and other non-target animals are not going to have enough downward pressure to spring the trap. So those are things that could be embraced by associations to, give people pan tension devices and measure and learn how to have higher pan tension. I'm trying to think. I didn't really research current technology, but there's a lot of stuff going on. I think people are looking more at trap design than at excluders. And most of my stuff is with hogs, which really doesn't have to do with this. So I guess I'm going to pass and say that the opportunity for technological improvements is great.
Yeah, I can take a little bit of that. And maybe even Kevin wants to chime in on some of the technologies they're using. There are a number of tools, some more expensive than others, but I mean, at the very simplest, I didn't comment on it last time, but in talking about the BMPs, those types of aftermarket modifications that trappers are constantly using have gotten now to the manufacturers. And so the manufacturers are already now creating traps that you buy off the shelf that already have a lot of those features already inherent in them. But no trap is ready for deployment right off the shelf nonetheless. But so there's one area, I guess, where technology is starting to change and adapt. Other things that are available are trap smart devices, or devices where a trapper is notified when a trap is deployed. Those are not cheap. They're prone to errors. They can either send you text messages, or you have trail cameras up that can send you instant notification of the animal being in the trap. But now you're starting to have to get one of those devices for every single one of your traps, or a lot of issues still there too. And as our commission heard, definitely some concerns about certain traps or certain camera traps and sending instantaneous information. Some interest in potentially looking into how to regulate that or prohibit that. So there might be some unintentional consequences heading down that pathway. One topic that comes up in a lot of other states, hasn't quite yet in Oregon, but the use of drones. Using drones to help go check traps can sometimes speed up the process, especially like if you've got a trap in the middle of a swamp. Now you don't have to take that long, laborious hike out there. You can send the drone, but then again, there is still always, from the states dealing with those regulations, they still kind of want the hands-on type of an approach. They want the trapper to be closer to that trap, just because, as you mentioned earlier, you can have put up binoculars up, you could be just fine. It's like, nah, there's probably a lot of times you could be missing things. You don't know the trap's gone, and you can't tell that from a drone. You can't tell that from binoculars. Not to mention drones aren't cheap. And it also limits where you can fly drones. And as we know, all of the regulations associated with using those types of things. So there are some really creative ways that the technology are adapting to help trappers be quicker, more efficient, more effective, especially to address the BMPs. But the feral hog stuff with the sounders, I mean, some of that trap technology is relevant, but we're not setting dozen, corral traps for hogs. We're setting like one, so we can spend a couple grand on just that one trap. It doesn't apply too well to having a lot of other traps out.
Kevin, I see your hands up. You want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add, Derek, suggested that I chime in and add, and just to acknowledge that Wildlife Services as a whole has been, Dave mentioned, in looking at ways to improve technologies, delivering devices, improvements to equipment. We were certainly involved in a lot of the original trap monitoring devices and testing of those features. There's a lot of additional commercial models out there, but I think Derek really alluded to some of the challenge with those is, one, there's obviously a cost, but there's the reliability and the certainty and whether it's going to meet a requirement. And I think largely where those are utilized and deployed, it helps us to know when to get there sooner, but not that it's going to replace that need to probably still check. And so when you have a lot of equipment out, you might be able to prioritize where you go first. But again, that only works when you're in a more geographically defined area versus over a very large geographic area where you may not even be within reach of picking up those devices. And so it's still a matter of getting there. So technology certainly is improving. Commercial products are available. USD as a whole is certainly involved in research and looking at those things. And I think there's things still yet to come that are going to make things even better.
Yeah. Thank you both. I am in total agreement. Derek, I am really excited about some of the changes that manufacturers are making. I'm field testing a new live trap by Tomahawk, which has some great innovations to minimize suffering. But one of the key divisive issues on the 2021 or 2019 Montana Trappers Advisory Committee was that the committee recommended that all the old equipment that's out there, Grandpa's shed, all the old traps that are hanging around that kids pick up, just like I did when I was 10 with my grandpa's traps. A lot of those devices are the same devices that Jeremiah Johnson used with very few improvements. And we recommended that there be a program to update those and to help give the bottom swivels and to upgrade those probably millions of traps in the United States, certainly thousands in Montana. And that one kind of hit a wall because it was a burden. It was a burden to update even the oldest technology to modern technology. But again, in summary, technology is going to play a role in what happens in trapping in the future. But I think it has to be consistent, and some of the outdated devices probably need to be taken off the shelf, literally.
So we're coming up against the end of our time with Dave. So we've got time for probably another question if people have one more. If there's one more question for Dave. Greg?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I would just say that one of the things that I know the public is concerned about is animal suffering, and not, quote unquote animal suffering, but, actual animal suffering. And I think one of the arguments is that you look at, the anatomy, the physiology of mammals, and, taxonomically, we're all considered mammals for a reason. Part of it is because we have similar nervous systems. And so, whether it's, it's a cougar or a deer mouse, I mean, the reaction to pain is similar because of the anatomical similarities. So I'm just saying it would have been good to have a veterinarian on this panel to be able to talk about that, because I know that's something that the public cares about, is pain being inflicted on animals that are in many ways very similar to humans. So just want to make that comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Greg. And we can certainly, as when we talk about next steps in the next meeting, because a number of us have talked about bringing a veterinarian forward for that very issue. So we just haven't made that connection yet with the agendas.
Our department, we have a state veterinarian in our department, and maybe that would be a good person to bring. What do you think, Derek? Do you think that he'd be willing to come out?
Yeah, either one of our veterinarians, I think, could be adequate to address those questions.
Yeah, sure. Okay. All right, thanks.
So Dave, you've got a minute or two to wrap up. What words of wisdom do you want to leave us with? Because, you know, this, as we talked with you about, this group is really all about looking at trap check time intervals and the difference between fur bearer and predator, and you know, and what we need to be doing either the same or differently here in Oregon, and how, you know, technology and, you know, all these issues that you brought up factor into that.
Yes.
So.
Okay, well, yeah. Well, first of all, total appreciation. Having served on 2 of these committees, I know that it is difficult to arrive at compromise, but I do think compromise is the ultimate solution, that there are some things that can be done, and the public maybe isn't demanding today, but at some point will demand that things change so that they are not exposed to seeing injured wildlife on public lands. I mean, I should say we all go hiking and expect to see a porcupine or a skunk or even a black bear, but we do have a realistic expectation that we're not going to be confronted with a man-made device, which is on our public lands to convert public property to private property. So I applaud you. I say some decisions are tough, but tough decisions are usually good ones. So consider the input you're getting. Talk to, you've got a good representation of groups, and may you choose wisely.
Dave, thank you for your time today. So with that group, I'm going to go ahead and shift gears over to Michael, so we can take a deep breath and get a glass of water. And do we need to take a tiny break? Are we all good? Because it's a little bit longer meeting today. I'm not seeing anybody jumping at it. All right, Stan's already got his coffee. Okay, well, so Michael, yeah, we'll go ahead and shift it to you. And I think, Michael, you've got some slides to share with us. Is that right? Okay. Yes. And then if you can just take a minute or so to introduce yourself to all of us a little more completely, that would be great as well.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, I think it's good to go. Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Nelson. I am a professor of environmental ethics and philosophy at OSU. I'm trained as a philosopher, but I spend all of my time working with scientists. I'm actually located in the College of Forestry here at OSU. I lead a large long-term ecological research program in the Cascades, sponsored by the National Science Foundation. I work all the time with ecologists and social scientists, and I have a long history of doing kind of work at the intersection of social science, ecology, and ethics in wildlife issues. So I want to thank you for this invitation, and I want to thank you for taking on this work. The work that you're taking on is important, and I appreciate, just from listening to Dave so far, how challenging it is. Let's see, move slides. So I want to say a couple of things that that should comfort you. I offer these as comfort. These questions about trapping or how to interact with animals, or how as humans we interact with the more than human world, these are questions that are very old. They have been with us for a long time, and they're questions that are everywhere. I have lived and worked in Wisconsin, Michigan, Idaho, now Oregon. I've done work in all parts of the United States and in other parts of the world, and everybody's engaged in the same kind of conversation. And I think that's great. I think it's really important that we take this as a serious conversation. The other thing I want to suggest is that this is probably older than we think it might be. We think of animal rights showing up in the 1960s and 1970s, but it was really the 90s, but it was actually the 1890s. So the first book on called Animal Rights, written by Henry Salt, was 1894. Even if you go back even further in time, you go back at least to 1789, and the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who talked about animal rights. He doesn't necessarily use the word rights, and you'll see why in a second. And Bentham is a very influential British thinker who has an awful lot to do with the way things are structured in the United States, actually. So 1870 or 1789, Bentham is suggesting things like this: a civilized society must count animals as worthy of moral consideration and ethical treatment. Why should they do that? Well, for Bentham, it was really about sentience. It was about the capacity to experience pleasure and pain or suffering. So for him, it wasn't about, are they rational or can they talk, but can they suffer? So what Bentham goes on to say is, for him, this is just for him, it is suffering that's really important. And he asks the question, well, what else is it that should trace the insuperable line, to use his words? And really what he's talking about here is, how do we decide what is within the moral community and what is outside of the moral community? We all individually have a moral community. We kind of collectively have one as well. Things that are within our moral community are things that we think they have direct moral standing. They count on their own. They don't count because they benefit us in some way. We just attribute them what we sometimes call intrinsic value, or sometimes we use words like inherent value or inherent worth. And what Bentham is asking in this question is, well, how should we determine what belongs inside and what's left outside? In other words, what's the key to moral consideration? If I asked you to list all the things that are in your moral community, and I'd say, well, what do they all have in common? Why do you put them there? You're going to offer me, upon reflection, probably a key, a reason. And it's often a quality. We appeal to a quality that something has. Bentham's already mentioned a couple, right? The ability to speak or to use language, the rational capacity, sentience, and history is littered with a bunch of options that we could take here. So the question is, how should we go about doing this? So in some ways, there's, it sometimes feels new, but there's in some ways very little new that's under the sun in these conversations. I've seen these sort of patterns of these conversations. I deal a lot with wolf issues, and the same thing seems to happen in all of the states that I experience. A couple of things do change, though. Science changes. So science can actually influence ethics by showing us that something possesses what we already thought perhaps was the key to moral consideration. So if Bentham thought sentience was the key to moral consideration, the ability to experience pleasure and pain, science can learn about what animals can experience that and which ones cannot. And we know there's kind of a history of that conversation. The other thing we know, and I'll show you a little bit more about this in a minute, is that while they sometimes change slowly, senses of value, what's important, can change as well. Things can, our moral communities collectively or individually, hopefully individually, but I think certainly collectively, can become larger or smaller over time. And I'll show you some research that suggests that, in fact, this has happened. So just a quick outline of what I want to talk about. I want to present to you something called the is-ought problem that helps us understand ethics a little bit. I want to give you just a quick overview of animal ethics positions. What is this? What does the history of this debate look like? And what are the different positions that people hold? And then I just want to share with you some empirical work that I and my colleagues have done on people's attitudes toward wildlife that I think you'll find interesting. And my goal is really pretty simple. I just want to introduce a kind of basic familiarity with ethics and animal ethics, and have a conversation that follows. So about 400 years ago, somebody realized that the people he was hanging out with were trying to derive prescriptions for actions from lists of facts. That, we know this about the world, this about the world, therefore we should do this. And he realized that that's fallacious reasoning, that you can't derive an ought, a prescription for action, from a set of facts alone. And he sort of coined this, the is-ought problem, that if you have an ought, if you're trying to arrive at a prescription for action, you have to, somewhere in your argument, have something that is normative or ethical or a value statement. And another way to say that is this practical syllogism here. So a syllogism is just it's an argument that has two premises. Think of premises as evidence, and that you arrive at a conclusion. And so a practical syllogism is where you have two premises and your conclusion is prescriptive. We ought to do something. That's exactly what you all are engaged in, is a practical exercise. You're trying to reach a prescription for action. So the practical syllogism also, what we should note here is that it has to have a descriptive element to it, right? Empirical, this is the way the world is. This is often what we get from science. But it has to, as a matter of logic, also have to have this normative or ethical dimension too. This is what we value, believe is right, or the way the world ought to be. And it's only by bringing these two things together that you can arrive at a prescription for action. And I recognize that for some of us, this is uncomfortable, and we often go to amazing lengths to avoid having conversations about P2, but just from the point of view of logic, it has to work this way. We often just don't state the normative premise. We assume it. So this is just a really super generic example that one way to think about what your exercise is with this group. So maybe your premise is something, your empirical premise is something like, well, if we have this kind of trap check times, it will result in this other thing. And if we have this trap check time, it won't result in those other things. So that's just a descriptive premise. And so there's a temptation to go to a conclusion that says, therefore, we should have those other ones that won't get us that condition. But you have to have a premise that suggests that the why one, the where we're going, is something that we ought not to, that's a place that we ought not to go. So again, it's just illustrating the practical syllogism in maybe a way to think about the work that you're doing. So when I teach ethics, I teach classes in environmental ethics and critical thinking, I use this image for my students. And one of the reasons I show them this image is because it reminds me of a palette. And it's interesting to see that there are a number of different kind of theoretical positions that could underpin, well, any ethic, but certainly an animal ethic, right? Sometimes when we're trying to decide what we ought to do, right, we're judging actions, behaviors, policies, we're looking at the consequences. Well, what happens if we do this or don't do that? So that's one approach to ethics. Utilitarianism, pragmatism, is about consequences. Well, we don't always do that. Sometimes we say it's not about consequences, it's about adhering to some sort of external authority. It's about deciding what is natural. And we want to adhere our practices to naturalness. It's called natural law theory. It's not about consequences, it's about appealing to naturalness. Sometimes we think, we want to honor the command of a divinity, right? So we find guidance in a sacred text called divine command theory, another kind of ethical theory. And sometimes, I'm thinking of my mom right now. My mom says, I don't care that it worked out okay. You did that for the wrong reason. The fact that it worked out okay doesn't make it okay. So sometimes people say, no, it's not about the consequences or external authority. It's about what your motives were. Did you respect the rights of rights possessors? Did you act from a sense of duty? Or, did you embody a set of virtues that human beings, we think sometimes are supposed to embody? And we use words like respect, humility, care, love, empathy as a way to talk about those virtues. So it's really interesting that we have a real, and I'm probably selling, I know I am selling these theories a bit short, but even this diagram suggests that there's a lot of ways that we could talk about animal ethics. And yet we tend to talk about it in very simple terms. So there are really two main camps. If I look at recent history, where these conversations have become important to us, the one main camp, it comes from a philosopher, Peter Singer. It comes from the mid-1970s. And Peter Singer is very much like Jeremy Bentham. He's a utilitarian. Sentience, the ability, the capacity to experience pleasure and pain is what Singer is interested in. And I'll use the practical syllogism to show you that this is basically his argument. And you can see how it's all about utility at the end of the day. It's about consequences. So non-human animals are sentient beings, a statement of fact for Singer. P2, we ought not cause sentient beings to suffer unnecessarily. Therefore, we ought not to cause non-human animals to suffer unnecessarily. So when I read your notions of humane, I saw a lot of this in there. A lot of you were appealing to things like suffering or kind of utilitarian assumptions about humane. But interestingly, not everybody. You had different, you weren't all utilitarian, even in your notion of humane. The other camp suggests that it's not really about suffering, that what you do to someone or an animal it's not about whether you cause them suffering or whether you alleviated their suffering. It's about whether or not you honored their rights. So this is Tom Reagan's position from the early 1980s. So one of the things I think you should notice right away is that when you talk about animal rights, you're actually talking about just a subset of animal ethics. So there is a position in animal rights, but it's not all rights-based. So Reagan's position looks like this. He thinks that what Reagan believes is that the key to moral consideration, if you think about that moral community thing, is whether or not something is an experiencing subject of a life. Does it have, is it purposive in some way? So he thinks that non-human animals are experiencing subjects of a life, and that experiencing subjects of a life have rights. That's the measure of rights for Reagan, and those rights shouldn't be violated. The most basic one is just the right to continue to exist. So we ought to respect the rights of non-human animals, according to Reagan, and especially the right to continue to exist. So you can kind of see that Reagan's position is going to be it's a little stronger theoretical claim. It's a little bit more of a dramatic theoretical claim. He doesn't have words like unnecessarily in here, which is inevitably the case for Singer. So those are the two main camps, are very different camps. The theoretical foundation of them is incredibly different. I want to just note a couple of things about them. They would condemn or embrace different things. There'd be a lot of overlap in which entities counted and which practices should be changed or gotten rid of. But they'd come to very different conclusions. They would say different things about trapping. Reagan probably wouldn't care much about the fact that we alleviate the suffering of the animal. He's like, that's not the point. It's something else. So they have very different opinions about something like trapping or hunting or many things, actually. I think it's interesting to note that in theory, both of them could be overridden. So if you can alleviate suffering, Singer doesn't really have a complaint anymore because he thinks it's all about suffering. So you could override something like, I guess, killing anyone or an animal if you could alleviate. It's all about alleviating suffering. So that can be overridden. Rights are harder to overwrite, but we know we do it. We do it in the human realm, right? We have a right to freedom, and yet at times, given people's behaviors, we curtail those rights. So it is possible to not take away somebody's rights, but override those rights. So both of them have a more flexibility, I think, than they're sometimes given credit for. And so you might think, well, if they can be traded off, are they what good are they? And I think the thing that's most important about these kinds of arguments is that they shift the burden of proof. And they shift it on to those who want to do the overriding and not on to those who don't want to do the overriding. So they're powerful, like the notion of intrinsic value shifts the burden of proof onto those that would override the intrinsic value of something that was important. So it's the difference between a judicial system where you're innocent until proven guilty versus one where you're guilty till proven innocent or you're indifferent. So it is powerful, even though it's not absolute. So back to this diagram, I think it's interesting. I'm just listing 6 different kinds of approaches you could take with animal ethics. And by far the dominant camps are really only 2 of them. I don't think we've explored what this might look like as far as we possibly could. And I'll just give you one example, which is a very different way to think about hunting, trapping, forestry, whatever. And it comes really from the virtue perspective. I have a colleague, she's a writer, she's a moss ecologist, she's a Potawatomi Indian, her name's Robin Kimmer. Some of you might have read her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And one of the things Robin talks about is, she says, look, any interaction, any harvest of the forest, the ocean, the animals, it's a harvest. And so we can ask ourselves, and obviously honor is a virtue that we think is important, what constitutes an honorable harvest? What does that look like? What does that demand of us? If we thought of the things from the world as gifts, and automatically we have a concept of reciprocity that has to come into play, how would that change our conversations? And I think you can start to glimpse how different our conversations might be if we sort of twisted the focus of those conversations sometimes just a little bit. So now some empirical things that empirically might be interesting. I did a project with a couple of colleagues a few years ago in the peer-reviewed journal Conservation Biology. And one of the things we wanted to know was how willing we did this both in Ohio with 3,000 respondents and then nationwide with a similar number. How willing are people to attribute intrinsic value to wildlife? When given the opportunity to say wildlife matters for its own sake or beyond its use value, what would people actually say? So what we found, two things I think are surprising. What we found was in Ohio, and the number was very similar nationwide, it was actually about 82% of the respondents. We asked two different questions about this attribution, and we flipped the responses where you had to answer yes to one and no to the other in order to count. And 82% of the people said they acknowledged the intrinsic value of wildlife. And the second interesting thing is that it doesn't seem to vary all that much from given any demographic variable, which is really weird, right? So if you're hunters, anglers, trappers, you're a wildlife viewer, there's not a lot of variation. The most important thing to realize is how high all of these numbers are. And then we sliced and diced the demographic information in various ways. You know, you didn't engage in activities with wildlife. You were consumptive only, consumptive and non-consumptive, or purely non-consumptive. Not a huge amount of variation. The variation isn't what's striking, it's how high the number is. The rural-urban distinction didn't seem to matter all that much, still high attributions. Education, age, income, gender didn't matter all that much. The most telling thing was education. And even at its lowest, it's still 2/3 of the people who are willing to attribute intrinsic value to wildlife. So this sort of tells you something about where people are at. Now, I don't know exactly what they mean by wildlife. Do they mean individual animals? Do they mean collectives? We don't know. And we don't know how readily they would trade that off. It's unclear. But there is this sense that I think surprised us that was a way higher attribution than we were anticipating. The other bit of empirical information that I'll share with you is just a rough description of a series of studies. The first one was done in '79 by Stephen Kellert. It was repeated. This is an attitude survey about wildlife in 2004, and then again in 2018. So you have 3 data points, but you have a pretty long period of time. And what they wanted to know was, over time at least, what's the change? And the change from what they call a domination framework, a domination relationship between humans and wildlife, and that emphasizes the use of animals for human material benefits, versus what they call mutualism, where animals are viewed as part of the moral community that we saw early on with the Bentham and the insuperable line. So where are people at? The details aren't as important as the fact that it looks like we are becoming more mutualistic over time, that's the directionality that we see. And interestingly, we even see it if you parse out the demographics generationally. So, this is just, you got your generations right on the x-axis here. And we know that millennials are, more inclusive than the previous generation, the previous generation, and the previous generation. So we're seeing this both within generational cohorts and then as a population collectively. And I think I'm just going to stop there with the empirical stuff. And then I will stop sharing.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Michael. That was that was really interesting, and a really interesting take on this. I think one of the issues that the group has struggled a little bit with, I don't know, maybe not struggle might be too strong of a word, is this sense of kind of who's suffering, alleviating who's suffering. And so, for example, when you're predator trapping often to alleviate livestock animal suffering, and so, kind of, I mean, how do you weigh that?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one thing that we've sort of talked about. It's like, well, I mean, there's damage, and then, if there's damage to, to crops, but there's also this notion of alleviating other animal suffering. And then there's the idea around, trapping as a tool to manage wildlife populations to alleviate wildlife suffering from starvation, from disease, from other kinds of issues. So anyway, can you just talk a little bit about that? Because I think we've kind of gone around about those as well.
Yeah, that's almost inevitable given that approach. We're notoriously bad at full cost accounting. We tend to overestimate the benefits and underestimate the costs, especially if those things apply to us. Trying to understand the complete causal network of suffering we almost always stop it. We almost always confine it in some way, and therefore we don't tell the full story. We're making inferences about suffering. We don't know, we don't always know if we're using the word the same way. We sometimes use the word to apply to, we even use the word animal and wildlife, and sometimes we mean individual living things, and sometimes we mean collectives like populations and species, and sometimes we mean both, and sometimes we're using these words in different ways. So we kind of reach this impasse. And then sometimes we'll use the word suffering to apply to things like, well, the ecosystem is suffering. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong, but that's a little bit of an equivocation, because I'm not sure we're using that word in quite the same way as we would with an individual living thing. And I think what I'm illustrating really is that utilitarianism is really a tempting way to think about this, because it's like, wow, I can quantify it. In fact, Jeremy Bentham invented a unit of sentience he called the utile. And so he wanted to have a common currency for all sentience and all pleasure and pain. So that's how much the temptation, and we love quantifying things, but it's really, really difficult in this case. So I think it's kind of inevitable that if you take that approach, you're going to have those issues, because they're kind of baked into the theory of utilitarianism to begin with. That's not a very hopeful answer, I realize.
No, it's not. So the other part, I think, and then I'll see if there's any hands up for any questions of Michael, is this undercurrent of that that some groups or some activities are inherently care more about the animals than others. And I think that really strikes a chord, here, because what we hear here, and I think what your empirical data showed, is that the general population, whether they're consumptive or not, pretty much across the board value wildlife. And I think that, and so, if this group gets anything out of your conversation, I think that's a really important takeaway, because I think a lot of what we do is circle around, we're trying to get at minimizing suffering. We're trying to get at practical application. We're trying to get at, kind of the business case, for what we're trying to do, but across the board, and so as we come at it in different ways, there's this temptation to say like, well, I care more about the animals than you do. And that really strikes a chord, I think, in a not helpful way, in this particular group, because I think, and I really liked that your data showed that across the board, people value, people value the intrinsic value of wildlife. And so I would hope that that's like a foundation that we can build up from in this group. So I don't know if there's anything, I don't know if I'm taking away something not right from what I
it's
saw.
great. We don't, you can attribute intrinsic value probably for different reasons, and we don't know why somebody does that necessarily, and it probably could be for a variety of reasons. I mean, our data is not alone. Other people have done this work in other places, and we see similar things. To me, it's been a profound finding, because I used to think that my job as an environmental ethicist was to somehow convince people that the more than human world possessed intrinsic value, that it was worthy in its own right. And now I don't think that anymore, because it turns out they already do, it seems, think that. And so it changes, in some ways it changed my work from, the job is to convince people they have, that the world has intrinsic value, to finding ways to allow people's sense of intrinsic value to actually match how they live in the world. In other words, it becomes a project of integrity, right? Integer wholeness, matching how I live with what I value and what I think is important. It's a very, very different job all of a sudden that I find myself with.
So group, what questions do you have for Michael, or even just reflections? I mean, sort of like along my lines of, these kind of little ahas in listening to him and trying to figure out sort of where that common ground is among all of us that we can build up from. Greg?
Yeah. Oh, so thank you, Dr. Nelson. I felt like I was back in college again. There was a lot in there. So thank you. I think you broke it down really well. And I think, and I know that study, it just went back to 1979, but this is just a comment. I think a lot of that shift has to do with just the urbanization, of our country over time, and so many people being farther away from nature, not having the same appreciation for nature, not having the kinds of jobs and occupations that cause them to interface with nature and the natural world. So I think that has a lot to do with it. It's exposure that people have. Anyway, that was just my comment. But I think I guess the other comment on that is that you're saying, you have this data, but you don't really, there's different definitions of terms and how people use words. And so we don't know, just from this study, why people are valuing wildlife. They could be valuing wildlife for different reasons. Mm-hmm. They could be valuing wildlife because wildlife can provide a sustenance for their family, right? Or they can value wildlife just because they like watching flocks of birds, or they're just there's a whole spectrum. So I think that it's good that it shows that commonality, and we don't really know the reasoning behind it, because the study didn't go into that deep layer. So anyway, just a comment.
Yeah, the rest of that project actually suggests exactly what you're suggesting, is that the driver of that change is urbanization. But it's really interesting because that runs contrary to the idea that the more rural we are, the more we'll value nature, and suggests that the more urban we are, so something's going on there that now that confirms some people's ideas as well. So that's what they conclude is the dominant driver of that value shift. It's just we're becoming more urban.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Jill?
Yeah. And Shannon Hearn can probably help out with this, but one of our commission meetings where we were presented with a survey of ODFW and Oregonians, that was done to try to get a sense of the, not the ethics, but of the values of wildlife. And while everybody had very high intrinsic value, I would say, based on that study. But the thing with most ODFW staff viewed that animals were much more on the utilitarian side of value than just on the plain, they're there. That's great. We love that they're there type of thing. So I found that very interesting. And obviously a lot of ODFW takes, advantage of using fish and wildlife, fishing and hunting and trapping, rather than only viewing and bird watching or viewing animals. So I don't know, Shannon, do you want to add anything else from that? I can't remember the name of the group that did it, but.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Zarnowitz. And Dr. Nelson, you probably have seen this study. It was the national study of America's values around wildlife. And it was really looking at where we were at comparatively across states, but over time, as well as, these traditional mindsets of use of wildlife, which is being more mutualistic and, wanting to live amongst them. And not seeing them so much from the utilitarian standpoint. And there was the shift in Oregon, but there still was these strong ties to, linking ourselves to the use of the resource very strongly.
Yeah, I think the slides I showed you are actually from my colleague, Jeremy Bruscotter, who's one of the co-authors. And I think it's the same. I think it's the same thing because he had other slides that showed state and region transitions over time. So how does this is interesting because I know just a little bit about the literature on trust, and trust is premised upon a sense of shared values. So when I believe that you and I share values, the more I believe that, the more likely I am to trust you. And so I'm going to say this awkwardly, I know, but did you have a conversation about, and how awkward was it? Wow, because agencies always have this trust issue. I've worked with agencies a lot, and federal as well, that they don't feel trusted. And so if trust is a sense of shared values, the survey might have revealed that, oh wow, we don't share values, and that might explain trust. And then the next question would be, should we do something about it or not? Did you have that conversation?
Dr. Nelson, that's exactly kind of the purpose of the study. And then each state was kind of looking towards, the relevancy of state agencies in that conversation based on the trust and how they're perceived. Again, Oregon is scored pretty high still. But what it really indicated is that we have to be careful because there is a shift occurring that we've all been aware of, that really people are questioning whether we represent all of the public and not just traditional user groups. And so we've spent a lot of time messaging about the conservation programs we have, our really role and mission and where it came from, and the value of all wildlife. And it helps and it resonates. I guess the other thing I wanted to say is today I just really appreciated this conversation. I have colleagues that work in other states where their results were very different. I'll say that. And the hardest states to work in, one might think, is where everyone's aligned, but it's where everyone really, at the end of the day, wildlife is like a secondary thought to their society. And we don't have that in Oregon. We very much know we have strong, passionate compassion for wildlife in this state. And, working for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, I wouldn't want to work in another state, even if it was easier and less, confrontational and less conflict. If that were the case, I wouldn't want to be a part of that.
I've lived here 9 years. I'm very happy to be here.
Other questions for Michael? We've got a little bit more time with him, or other reflections. Kelly?
Thank you. Oh, Dr. Nelson, thank you so much. I want to comment on, I think, how grateful I have been, even with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, the creation of the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund really does speak to incorporating non-game and all wildlife. So I want to acknowledge that. And having been a native Oregonian and started working with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife way back, and this gets to a question, Dr. Nelson, back in 1999, when the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife recommended to the commission to ban canned hunts of wildlife in Oregon. And they did that on the premise of ethics and on values, stated values of hunters and where the public is. And I guess this gets to how ethics and values play a role in our laws, our wildlife laws. And you touched on that. I feel like it's that third, if you have a triangle, it's that piece. And it's an important part for this work group to be considering. And I don't know, I guess it's a reflection, whether it's necessarily I just wanted to ask you in that piece, have you done any review of that and how?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that comes up regularly is what's the relationship between ethics and laws? And, in an ideal society, we would believe that laws are the embodiment of our collective ethics. And as our ethics changed, our laws would change. None of us are naive enough to think that that's actually always the case. But we do have some examples, I think, of some really powerful laws in conservation that are exactly that. I think of the Wilderness Act of 1964 as an example, the embodiment of this idea that some land should only be treated in certain ways, and it was like quintessentially American as well. And then I think the most dramatic one for me is the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act is absolutely the embodiment of the idea that species deserve to persist, and we don't have a right to eradicate them. And kind of period, especially when you look at all the literature kind of around the Endangered Species Act, they make it really clear. It's not about, wow, that's going to be expensive. It doesn't matter. It's a really moral argument. And it's one of the things that's really interesting is we sometimes get, and I think this is an issue of scale. We think, wow, lots of people don't like the Endangered Species Act. And it turns out that 35 million people don't like it in this country. Turns out that's also 10%. So over and over again, when we do public surveys, and there are 3 of them that I'm aware of, we see roughly 90% endorsement of the Endangered Species Act. So if we make it percentages instead of numbers, we change the scale in some way. And I think that's perfectly consistent, that idea that we endorse the Endangered Species Act collectively. It's perfectly consistent with the other data I showed, that we attribute that kind of moral standing to wildlife. It's not the same exact number, but both of those numbers are incredibly high, especially considering if we just pay attention to public discourse, we would think it's really different than it actually is. But yeah, that interplay is, and that's one of the reasons why we propose to change laws, right? We learn something about animals, about something, and then we look at our laws and we're like, wow, that's no longer consistent with what we know. Or our values change and we say, is that consistent with how we think we ought to act in the world? And we're like, yeah, no, think about all the old laws that are still in the books that when they get eradicated, we laugh about. Like, I can't believe somebody regulated hat size. It's just crazy laws from the past that just don't even apply anymore because we're different people in many ways.
Thanks for that, Kelly. Jim, I saw you wave a little bit, and so I want to make sure that you jump in here. And Greg, I do see your hand up too, but Jim, go ahead. Yeah, you got it. You got it.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that I do have to leave at this point. I'll let Stan take over as my primary, and I want to thank everybody for their participation today.
Thanks, Jim, for that. Greg, and then Kevin.
Okay, thanks. So you talked about honorable harvest, which to me sounds like it kind of ties in more with Regan's thesis of rights being honored. I had gotten up just for a second to get a snack, so I only heard it out of one ear. I think you mentioned a colleague of yours, Robin, that had written a book about this. And I just wondering, what does honorable harvest look like to you?
To me, it looks like a conversation, actually. And I've been really interested lately in how people will describe conversations and they'll describe the setup, and I can now guess exactly where it's going to go. And it's almost always an impasse. And so I've been really interested in how do you just kind of shift the conversation a little bit. And I think in some ways, I'm in the College of Forestry, right? And so we could have that conversation in the College of Forestry, and it would be a radically different conversation than the way we normally proceed things. And so for me, that's just the starting point. What does it mean to act with honor? And then I'd have to think about that and talk about that. So I don't really have that worked out in my own mind. And I do tend to really think that utilitarianism knots us up in the way that I illustrated. I think rights can do that as well. All these theories have challenges. But virtue theory, where the notion of honor comes from, that goes back to Aristotle. That's what he's talking about in the early days of ethics. And when I was an undergraduate and I had ethics classes, virtue theory wasn't even in our textbooks anymore. And so it was kind of reinvented, grabbed onto, and it was mostly grabbed onto because feminist philosophers said this is an important way that we think about morality, and they kind of reinvigorated this discussion about virtue. So anytime we would have just virtue conversations in general, like what does it mean to care for in this circumstance? What does it mean to express empathy in this circumstance? For me, it's even hard to imagine what some of those conversations would look like. And Robin's bringing this she's Potawatomi, and so she's bringing this from an Indigenous perspective. This is one of the ways that Indigenous peoples think about, how much you would take. They also think that the things of the world are gifts, and that you have an obligation to use them, but you have to use them in an honorable way. And so that's something that's kind of constantly on your mind. It's not about a calculation. It's about I'm trying to embody this character trait. I didn't answer your question because I don't really have an answer for myself necessarily.
That's okay. What's the name of her book?
Her book is called Braiding Sweetgrass. The book came out, I think, in 2003, and then just in the last year has absolutely exploded. So it's been on the bestseller list. It's sold over 500,000 copies, and it's really stunning.
Thank you.
It would be interesting, and I know, Shannon, you reached out through the governor's office to our tribal nations to be part of both the Beaver Work Group and this group's conversations. And it would be interesting to take this question back to them about honorable harvest and humane, and some of these questions, and hear from them for this group's benefit, sort of where they are on some of these issues. Kevin, and then Stan.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to both our presenters, Dave and Michael. Good information. I know in talking about the survey and looking at people that have common beliefs, they may be coming at that from a little bit different of a viewpoint, perspectives, and background, but that shared value is really important to understand, to really build and increase trust amongst participants as you're working at a table. In this case, and outside of here, I think that has a tremendous respect towards others when you see that there's shared value and the need to kind of get to a common ground. I know Dave mentioned kind of self-regulating, and my thoughts want to kind of go back to BMPs, and one of the stated principles of the best management practices is educating the trappers as one on those tools and methodologies that can be used to increase effectiveness as well as to reduce injuries. But also part of the BMP principles is educating the public there's a lot of information about the benefits to trapping from just even the science standpoint, and the values and, the North American model for wildlife management. But I think there's a lot of potential when we recognize shared values, even though they may come from different backgrounds. There's a lot of benefit in looking at those and building upon the strengths. I think that talking about the values in trapping and the things that are done, that self-regulating, that's something that trappers do on a regular basis. They have to set the stage for where they're at and what their circumstances are, and to analyze whether there is going to be other types of disturbances. They want to have an animal in that trap when they get back. They want to have the right animal in that trap when they get back to it. And they also want to make sure that they're not going to have additional disturbances to that. And they do value the animal and they want to reduce suffering. So there's a lot that is inherent in the thought process that's unscripted, but that is inherent in the process of someone that is trapping, that goes into understanding and calculating all those kind of risks as well as values. So I think there is so much that is being done that doesn't get talked about or emphasized, that it kind of really underrepresents the value of those BMPs, and perhaps doesn't then help equate to more common ground. But thank you to both the presenters for the information that you share.
Thanks, Kevin. That's really nicely stated.
Stan, you're up.
I want to thank both the gentlemen that presented. This was absolutely a very interesting and I think enlightening discussion. And I really liked Mr. Nelson's saying, let's put things into percentages instead of just having numbers. Yeah, I mean, it really does. That's what gives us the idea of what our society is actually thinking. And what's interesting is recent data shows that over 80% of Americans support hunting and over 90% support harvesting of fish and wildlife. And so those are just some percentages that are they're out there for us. I think how we design those harvest mechanisms, Dr. Nelson, you're spot on. How we share those values and make sure that all people are really thought of. And then just back to the earlier, when Dave was talking about how do we actually set our traps as far as how can we use making sure pan tensions. And I ran out to the shop there thinking I've got that pan tension device setter I wanted to bring back in and just hold up. But those are the type of things that both groups, Beaver and Prep Check, should be working and talking about. What are the mechanisms that we can use to lessen differences of opinions? And this actually was, of all the work groups we've been on, I think some of this discussion was what I think is most enlightening. I want to say thank you to both presenters.
Thanks, Stan.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that, Stan. So we're at a little after 4. Are there any other questions for Michael, for Dr. Nelson, or for Dave before we turn our attention to our next meeting and next steps? Not seeing any. Thank you both so much for being here. You're certainly welcome to stay while we talk about next steps. And I understand, Dave, I don't know, can you put, there you go. I see that you unmuted. Dave, I understand that you have some materials that you've forwarded to us for us to get out to the group. Dr. Nelson, I know that your slides will be part of the meeting record, and so they'll be put up as well. And so if there's any other information based on the conversation that we've just had that you think the group would benefit from, you can send it to us and we'll distribute it out to the group. If it's just even, other resources for them to look up on their own or anything else.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and good luck with your work.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. So turning our attention to next steps in our next meeting. So our next meeting is on October 26th, and it's what we had teed up having Kevin and ODFW basically talking about some of the questions around, how has APHIS modified their response in other states that have shorter trap check times, and what, let's take a deeper dive into other states with different trap check times in terms of their resources and regulations and classifications, to unpack this a little bit more, because there's been a lot of conversation about it's not apples to apples. It's, maybe not applicable here in Oregon. And so kind of taking a closer look at all of that. So that's what we've got teed up for the meeting on October 26th. And I think, what we're hoping to get at the, between now and then, what we need to start working on is, what are recommendations going to look like? Let's start thinking about some proposals of, what could work. And, I've listed out a number of items. If I had a whiteboard, I'd be writing them on them right now. But there are at least 4, categories of possible, packages of recommendations that could come out of this group. There's one around education, around trappers and around the public. There's one around a conversation around technology. How can technology help address some of the challenges that have been brought forward? What's the real, what is the reality of using technology, in different circumstances? How does that play? There's this whole concept that Dave introduced around self-regulation, and the trapping community of themselves. And so, what does that look like? What does that mean? What is the role of trappers in, in gathering data? I think there's a piece there. And then Dave also brought up this idea of device regulation, and, did talk about that there's inherent, issues around that. But I know we've sort of gone around about the fur bearer classification, predator classification. There are game animals that are trapped. There's different regulations around each. There's different times around each. How can we be more efficient across those, more clear, so that it doesn't create as much of an enforcement issue? So it's clearer to the public, it's clearer to trappers, and what does that look like? So those are kind of the big categories that I'm seeing that we may want to have some conversation around in terms of what packages and recommendations start to look like. That is inclusive of trap check times, but is also inclusive of a number of other things that we've been discussing. So I just lay those all out there, more for food for thought, because that's where we're headed. We're headed toward trying to come up with, what are we proposing as a group for the commission, and for staff to consider, and what do we know, what don't we know? So we don't need to have that conversation right now, but I'm putting that out there for us to be thinking about. So that's what our next meeting looks like, and that's kind of our next steps. So I'm going to pause there and just see if there's any conversation or questions. I know we've got, we have Kevin and we have Derek and Shannon and Jeff here with us today, and Derek, are you going to be with us on the 26th? Okay, good. And so, so now is an opportunity for them to hear from all of you about anything else that they should be putting a finer point on for our conversation on the 26th. So I'll pause. Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, so not for the 26th, but one of the things that I've appreciated about the Beaver Group is what you've been calling, Jamie, sort of foundational knowledge. The intersectionality of a lot of aspects of that conversation. There's hydrology and climate and all these different things. And so with trapping, one of the things that was beneficial to our commission in terms of foundational knowledge was talking about the economics of trapping. And so when I say economics of trapping, we talk about the benefits of the economic benefits of trapping, either to the trappers themselves or to the state of Oregon, the cost of administering a trapping program from the department, what is the revenue from trapping permits to the department, and that sort of thing. So, and Derek, I know that you presented that to us, and you have those tables and that sort of thing. Also like pelt values, how have those, changed and fluctuated among different species. And so to me, that's interesting foundational information as well. The economics of trapping. We have an economist on, the beaver group. We haven't really talked about economics in our group. And so I think that's an interesting part. I think, the states that have debated trapping and talked about, pros and cons, with either trap check or, other aspects of trapping. I mean, that's some of the things that they've looked at as sort of the economics of trapping. So I think that would be an interesting topic for the future.
Okay, duly noted. Tyler?
Yeah, Vice Chair Woolley, can you link that to the trap check interval? Like why we would need that foundational knowledge for this work group? I totally agree. For beaver management, it's applicable, but I'm just struggling to make the connection.
Well, again, it's understanding, we've learned about the mechanics of how traps work, that a lot of us are not familiar with. So I think understanding the industry more, to me, is an interesting aspect of this. For instance, Commissioner Hatfield-Hyde attended I'm not sure you would call it, what you call it, Tyler, you could tell me, but when all the pelts come to sort of an auction and there's kind of a selling and auction that happens. And so, I mean, that's part of the end product of what happens with trapping. And so, I think it's just, to me, it's interesting foundational information about the industry.
Stan?
Commissioner Woolley, the invitation that was extended to Commissioner Hyde was put on by the Oregon Territorial Council on Furs, which has actually several fur sales in Oregon, and there's the Idaho Trappers Association that has incredible fur sales. And so that would be good information for, I think, the group to analyze. And we were very willing to work with you and Jamie in assembling some of that. And Derek, I know, has extensive knowledge on that. So working with the National Trappers and Fur Takers of America, we'd be gladly to provide some of that information.
Okay. Thank you, Stan.
Quinn? Thanks, Stan.
One thing I made note of during Dave's presentation, he was talking about in other states, that citations didn't go up appreciably, when intervals were shortened. But I think that might be an interesting thing to look at when we're doing the comparison of states. I don't know if there's studies or if there's easily accessible data about economic ramifications of having shorter trap check times, but it seems like we might be able to get some information about citations related to that kind of regulation. But that might be helpful just for us to consider as well.
Okay, thanks for that, Quinn. Kevin and Derek, do you have any questions of the group that would help you with your presentation? I know we're going to get together and put our heads together, and but this is an opportunity for you all as well to.
Great question. I was actually kind of looking forward to Friday's conversation to kind of unpack what that was going to look like. I know that Derek has looked at some cross comparison with other states and land size, distance from roads, populations to people, and just trying to put things in perspective in comparison between species being trapped and some of those other data points. So I think that will kind of help to try and put things in comparison, but there's a lot of nuances from state to state, and some of the information that's been compiled thus far is a snapshot. It's not a complete, because a lot of states have some variabilities, as even I believe it was Dave mentioned earlier. There's some nuances between whether it's a fur season or whether it's USDA doing the trapping or whether it's a private individual doing the predatory animal removal. So there's a lot of nuances that have to be looked at to really try and make it comparable, and that might not be as readily done as we might think. So I do want to look to have a little bit more in-depth conversation about that dialogue before we get into the next group meeting so that we're organized. Derek, do you want to clarify anything that I just rambled through?
Yeah, I guess to kind of carry on with that, I mean, we talked about it at an earlier meeting, and I think it was even Commissioner Zarnowitz asked we start to do a little bit of poking around regarding differences in regulations specific to fur bearers, or typically what comes from a wildlife agency versus those for predatory animals, and as we had suspected, it gets really messy really fast the second you venture into the predatory stuff, because even Oregon having this much authority is kind of an anomaly. So yeah, if the group really wants us to dive deep into some of the predatory animal stuff, I think that would be helpful directive at this point, because it's going to take a little bit more time to do digging. Regarding, your regular, regulated activities of licensed fur takers, licensed trappers, from the state wildlife agency perspective, that data is ready to go. So, we probably needn't do a lot of prep work for there, but if we really want to dive into the predatory animal stuff, I think we need a little bit more direction and support for that. Or especially if there's like a particular concept to go after, because AFWA already does a lot of surveys on state regulations for all 50 states that we can query pretty easily and have composed those types of things. So I guess I'm just showing where I'm not as keen to the data and the resources on the predatory animal side of things versus the fur bearer data. But I do like that today's conversation even kind of set us up for some of this concept of self-regulation and what that means for even Quinn's request about citations, which I don't know. I don't know if there is something that's a larger data set or a national law enforcement consortium. Maybe Stan may know, or Shannon might know, if there's any AFWA work groups, but certainly, self-regulation, you would indeed assume that that's going to have less citations, because the folks getting the citations are the ones that supported the regulation to be implemented, which perhaps could have just been reflecting their current actions as is, but versus, other non-self-regulation changes. So I think this conversation set us up well to try to describe some of those nuances between the various states and their regulations.
All right. Well, I didn't really hear a question in there. It does sound like that, Derek was asking the group, how much or where you want to go on the predator side of things. Jill?
Well, we're statutorily hamstrung on the fur bearer side, from my understanding, and the predatory animal side is the one that has the longer time frames. So whatever we can gather on that, I think would be good to view, since the department does have that authority to set those trap check times.
Yeah, and I think that the nuance that, or the kind of glitch or inconsistency that, Shannon, that you brought up, I don't know, last meeting or the meeting before, that seems real critical. I can't articulate it at this moment, but sort of that exception around predators, that there was just sort of this lack of alignment or contradiction. And I mean, I'm sure you could restate it more clearly, but I think that is key to this question that we're asking.
This is Shannon, if you don't mind. That helps me, Commissioner Woolley, because I do have a question. I've kind of heard two things. One is really getting into the details of the data, a little bit around trap check times and enforcement. And we, like Derek said, we'll do what we can. I can't think of a place I've ever seen it laid out. We went from this trap check time to this trap check time, and then here's the change in citations written. But we can ask some states that that we know that did that to see if they have that analysis and we just haven't seen it. So we're getting kind of detailed on that side. But then there was also this discussion about baseline data, or not baseline understanding of, you know, the economics of this and who's operating and how they're operating. And that feeds into the question about the different trap check times, which are on page 2 of the rules. So would it be helpful to go over the regulations at all? Or do people who are sitting at this table know those in and out? That's my question. And it's Commissioner Woolley's too, because there is this hierarchy of trap check times, and we presented them once, but is it resonating? Sorry, Stan. Go.
Yeah, go Stan and then Jill.
You know, Shannon, you brought up a great point, and I do think there's a lot of misconceptions or misinterpretations of Oregon's OARs as a reference to both predators and to our fur bearer regulations. And where we're talking about the fur bearer regulations, I think there is a lot of, just people really don't understand that. And it gets back to Dave's assertion that we were very under-regulated. And I think when we were doing some work on the additional petition, there were over 20 actual regulations that pertain to just beaver harvest alone, and that were in our rules and regs. So I think having that discussion could be very enlightening. Thank you.
Jill?
Yeah, I think that the predator timeframes kind of gets back to what Kevin from APHIS was tasked with or asked to provide, which is that what is going on in other states relative to how your agency people deal with those trap check times on when they're dealing with predators.
Yes,
Yeah.
Commissioner. Yeah, and we've starting to have those conversations with other states, but it's also recognizing that each state being a service agency is based upon the needs of that state and within that state. In some states that might have a shorter trap check regulation for fur harvest or even predatory animals, and it might not be the emphasis of the wildlife services program in that state. And so we're trying to sort through the states that, have similar comparison of the activities and the services being provided, and then how that correlates then with what their trap check requirements are. So we're trying to look at and compile that so that we can kind of report back. And that's why I think if there are particular states that are drawing more question or interest, that I think would be very valuable to key in on versus just trying to broadly just find some states and talk about what some of those comparisons are or what isn't a comparable.
Well, if I may, I think what we've heard in the past from this group is what resonates more are states with similar geographies, and states with, dispersed population. So I think that those comparisons would be more meaningful than more densely populated states, or flatter states. So that I know that's one thing that I've heard this group talk about.
That came up a lot in the beaver group. Not just, I think Tyler, you brought this up, numerous times. Don't just pick some, Iowa or some state, comparisons.
Yeah, similar geographies.
Yeah, but geography, topography, climate, that sort of thing, I think is a good comparison. So that, to me, a lot of that's West Coast. Cascade Range, Sierra Range, all have, there's Central Valley, there's desert to the east, that sort of thing. And I think those, at least geographically, but I also agree with Chris, different states have different needs for trapping. And so you can't just, go across the board and say that, a given state change their laws and just have that as a standalone. You have to look at really what's going on with the needs for trapping, in a given state.
All right, I think that, we're just got like another minute left. Jill, your hand's up, and then let's wrap this up.
Yeah, just real quick. Yeah, I agree. The West Coast generally is more like us, but some of them have very liberal trap check times, and some like Washington and California may have some that are a lot more regulatory. So that's that mix I think we need to look at, and what the effect is on managing the trap checking. But people keep talking about the rest of the nation as though it's like one big flat plane. But, if you go into the Appalachians or up into the Northeast, those places are really rugged. And they could be comparisons too. You go up to Maine, Vermont, or anywhere in the Appalachians. My husband worked in the Appalachians and on wild boar, and he told me how rugged things were up there. So it's not, might not have a desert, and it might have a few more roads, but it's still pretty hard to get around.
Good point, Joe. Well, we've come up to the end of our time, and I just want to say, and this is going to sound a little motherly, but I am just so proud of this group for this meeting today. I mean, it just was wonderful to see, everyone be so open to listen to the presenters that we had. We did work hard to try to package the meeting in a way that we thought would provide a, just kind of a take a step back, but also be helpful to moving us forward. Just so appreciate, people's willingness and respectful listening, of each other and of our presenters. So really well done. Thank you so much for this meeting today. Really appreciate it. Look forward to a really good meeting on October 26th. And of course, Sam and I are, as many of you know, are always available for your phone calls, your emails. We'll follow up if you've got ideas, things that we need to strengthen. We'll do our best to get the agenda out well in advance so that you can respond to that, and we can tighten things up, if you will. I know that Derek and Kevin also, you can email them questions or things that have come up that you'd like them to address after we're done with our meeting. But well done, everybody. Thank you. And to our viewing public, I hope that you enjoyed this meeting as much as we did. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for sticking with us for an extra half hour. And I think we're all done here. So have a good rest of your day.